God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Jesus saw the creation account in Genesis as authoritative on the subject of marriage. And my friends, I suggest to you that whatever was authoritative for Jesus ought to be authoritative for you and me. And while Jesus, it is true, did not specifically speak about homosexuality, his establishment of the Genesis passages as the fundamental teaching on marriage leaves us no doubt as to his position on the gay lifestyle or gay marriage. Male and female bonding is the normal method, the one for which our bodies as well as our emotions are designed. And so God, in his sovereignty, created two unique creatures made for the purpose of reflecting his image in a permanent union that no other relationship can possibly come near to sufficing to the same end. And you know, the union between one man and one woman, marriage is something that is timeless, universal, and incredibly special. Throughout history, diverse cultures and faiths have upheld it as the ideal. Moreover, we ought to add that God gave marriage as the life-giving foundation that creates and sustains a culture. For we read God's command to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, saying, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." Marriage benefits society, especially children, in ways that no other relationship can. The lifelong faithful union of husband and wife promotes healthy, natural families for the common good of us all. And may I say that marriage is God's time-tested way of blessing as many children as possible with both a mom and a dad. You know, people often argue that the opposition to same-sex marriage today is much like our culture's opposition to interracial marriage many years ago. But I suggest that that comparison is untenable because race is irrelevant to marriage while gender is absolutely essential to it. Moms and dads are both necessary. And God made it that way. Neither is replaceable by some kind of generic adult. You know, I've known a lot of good men in the short time that I've lived, and many good men make good dads, but I've yet to see one good man yet that could make a good mom. And many good women make good moms. But even if she's a single mom and she's doing everything she possibly can to be everything to her child, she still cannot replace dad. Moms and dads are both necessary. And marriage sustains that ideal plan of God that children need a mama and a daddy. Marriage, as we currently know it, brings together the two halves of humanity, men and women that together reflect the image of God and provide for the ideal environment for raising children And thus marriage benefits in exceedingly positive ways men and women, their children, our economy, and the culture as a whole. And who would have ever dreamed that such a marvelous plan, conceived not simply by the social constructs of mankind, but by the very mind of God Himself, written into the laws of nature for the benefit of us all, would be attacked by a serious movement to replace God's order with a completely different arrangement. Now, I don't know how that strikes you, but let me tell you how it strikes me. To think that some of us would think for even a moment that we know better than God. Now, there's a point to be made here that I want to park on for a little while. It's a point, I believe, not generally understood. And I am convinced that if you don't understand this next point that I'm going to make, there will be a sense in which you will always be slipping and sliding and never on a firm footing on this question. We need to make something abundantly clear. Contrary to what many people think, the proposal today to legalize same-sex marriage is not something that would simply facilitate same-sex marriage existing alongside of traditional marriage as if it were just a different expression of the same institution. No. Instead, the institution of marriage would be legally redefined for everyone. Our historic understanding of marriage as the union of one man and one woman would be replaced by a new legal paradigm for marriage as the union of two adults, regardless of their gender. And that is why homosexual activist Michelangelo Signorile once said that same-sex marriage, quote, is a chance to wholly transform the definition of family in American culture. It will usher in a sea of change. And indeed, he is right. Please keep in mind that this redefined version of marriage as a genderless institution would be the only legally recognized definition of marriage in our state were same-sex marriage to ever be legalized. And such a radical change will produce a myriad of societal conflicts that government, exercising its broad enforcement powers, will have to resolve. Meaning that citizens, small businesses, and religious organizations whose own beliefs, traditions, morals, or ethnic upbringings that are at odds with this new legal definition would find themselves vulnerable to legal consequences if they are unwilling to comply or are at odds with this new legal orthodoxy on marriage. My friends, do you understand? Are you really hearing me? That is what is at the heart of this debate, and that is what this debate is really all about. Now, if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me just see if I can make it even a little simpler. I am saying that the legalization of same-sex marriage will create an entirely new legal paradigm for marriage for all of us. And if you are unwilling to get along, if you're unwilling to comply with this new legal definition of marriage, you are outside of the law. And you are vulnerable to the government using its powers to bring you into compliance. So it is not as simple as some would have us to believe. Why don't we just live and let live? You must not like homosexuals. You hate homosexuals. No, not at all. But it's not that simple anyway. Now, if you should wonder tonight whether this Baptist preacher is just full of a lot of hyperbole, or if he's trying to scare folks, or he's just fear-mongering, then let me just say that this is what's already happening in places where same-sex marriage has been legalized. Religious groups who've refused to make their facilities available for same-sex couples have lost their state tax exemption status. Catholic charities in Massachusetts have had to choose between fulfilling their social mission based on their religious beliefs or shut down. And because they were unwilling to compromise their religious convictions by adopting children out to same-sex couples, they had to shut down. School children in Massachusetts have been taught in 2nd grade about gay marriage, and when parents objected and took the matter to court, the courts ruled that the parents didn't have a right to prior notice, nor would they be allowed to opt their children out of class. Christian innkeepers in Vermont and New Hampshire have been sued over their refusal to make their facilities available for same-sex weddings. The U.S. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals just upheld the firing of a Christian counselor who lost her job at the Centers for Disease Control because of her refusal to advise a woman in a homosexual relationship. In other countries like Canada, where same-sex marriage is legal, the Alberta New Education Act proposed that parents of homeschoolers must refrain from teaching their children homosexuality is a sin as a part of their educational curriculum. And while I will be transparent with you in telling you that an upcoming election has halted that bill for the time being, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association is warning that the legislation is not dead for good. A man in that same country who owned a printing press was fined over $4,000 for refusing to print stationery for a gay activist organization. Pastors and priests in Canada often wonder if they can preach from Leviticus or Romans chapter 1 without reprisal from their government. You see what I'm telling you? If marriage is redefined to include same-sex relationships, then people who believe in marriage as one man and one woman will ultimately be declared the legal equivalents of bigots for acting on their religious or heartfelt beliefs. Refusal to accommodate and recognize same-sex marriages will be looked upon as the equivalent of racial discrimination. This is not an embellishment, my friends. This is what is already happening, where marriage has been redefined as a genderless institution. But I think, perhaps to the surprise of some of you, that there's even a greater reason than all of these for why we ought to protect marriage from redefinition when the government sanctions homosexual relationships, I suggest to you that the younger generation becomes confused about the real thing. It starts to lose its understanding of lifelong commitments, emotional bonding, the role of the husband, the role of the wife, the role of children, and more importantly, the sanctity of the institution. Marriage is ultimately reduced to something of a private partnership based solely on personal preferences, providing for little more than sexual convenience for adults and making certain that a number of government benefits are accessible. Nevertheless, it cannot provide for the kind of intimacy that's described in the book of Genesis. Cohabitation, or what so many of us were brought up knowing it as shacking up, as we called it. And short-term relationships are the inevitable result. And the only place that we need to look for proof of this is to the Netherlands, the Norwegians and the Swedes, places where same-sex marriage has been legal for some time, and now traditional marriage is becoming irrelevant. And on the way out, and no doubt these are rock-solid reasons why 63 million Americans in 30 states believed that it was critical for them to vote on the definition of marriage. And I'm telling you, my friends, now, until and unless voters approve the constitutional amendment for marriage here in North Carolina at the ballot box, North Carolina, the only state in all of the Southeast without such protections for traditional marriage, will be and remain a huge target for the legalization of same-sex marriage. And make no mistake, unless North Carolina passes this amendment, our present marriage laws, which define marriage as one man and one woman, are vulnerable to politicians and activist judges overturning them and imposing same-sex marriage right here. That is what occurred in other states where same-sex marriage is now legal. And I say this respectfully to everybody here. If you disagree with me on this, if you think for even a moment that it cannot happen here, all I can say to you is you are dead wrong. And I am sure that legislators like Dan Suchek and Edgar Starnes will vouch for me when I say, I walk those halls of power now, having done it for 13 years, and have kept a close eye on these gay advocacy groups who are looking for any moment that they can to make same-sex marriage here legal. Let me ask you a critical question. Who do you think ought to define marriage? I think if I were to ask that question on a spiritual level, most everybody here in this audience would say, I believe God defines marriage. But if I were to ask that question on a political level, who do you think ought to define marriage in this state? A judge? A bunch of showboating politicians? Or do you believe that that ought to be something, because it's such a foundational question, that ought to be reserved for the people of North Carolina themselves to decide? That's what this campaign is about. making certain that no activist judge redefines marriage in North Carolina. Not even the North Carolina General Assembly should redefine marriage or define it for us. Let the people of North Carolina do that. And when we elevate our current statute, which says that marriage is one man and one woman, to a constitutional amendment,